Hello, students. So today we will address the theme of modernism. This is the first of two talks about this theme. Next week, which is the final lecture, will continue and conclude modernism. So the themes for today are um, first, we will talk about classic music in Russia and the rise, which was a part of the rise of the cultural prestige of Russia. We will talk about um, romantic music reaching its end with the music of Gustav Mahler, the Austrian composer. And then a related theme to modernism, not to music and not to painting, but to literature, is the theme of modern terrorism, which is so much alive with us today, but it was actually first addressed at the beginning of the century, and it has been a theme and a part of modern time. And then we will hit modernism proper and look at impressionism. It's the relationship of colonialism to modernism. We will talk about Claude Debussy, who is the first to really begin modernist music. We'll talk about the concept of anxiety. Remember, we addressed that at the very beginning of the semester, and we said we are going to conclude with it. Okay, and then the most important philosopher of modernity, Friedrich Nietzsche, and then his impact on music and the arts. So let's begin with Russian culture and the rise of its prestige. Remember earlier on in the semester when I started talking about Germany, I told you that two civilizations would rise in the 19th century. In the first half, it would be Germany that would be so present. Remember, we said French culture dominated the century of the Enlightenment, the 18th century, and then we saw how German culture and literature rose in the first half of the 19th century thanks to Beethoven and all the other composers and the great writers and philosophers, especially Kant and Goethe. Okay, in the second half, it would be Russia who would rise to prominence and acquire so much prestige in European culture thanks to its literature. It has several great authors, but here I have for you the two most important ones, and that is Fyodor Dostoevsky and then Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. You probably have heard of them. Dostoevsky was such an interesting character. If you ever read his writings, they have something unique about them, and that's the depth and complexity of the characters that he creates. I don't know if that is related to his personal experience. Remember, we said in earlier lectures we talked about Nikolai II, whom I said was this Tsar of Russia, who was putting down revolutions. He was an absolute autocrat. He confronted a military coup early in his career, actually in the first year of his reign, in 1825, put it down brutally, and has been governing, ruling Russia in an absolutely autocratic, brutal way. And in order to terrorize the people into submission, and especially after the revolutions of 1848, in which he played such a prominent role. Remember when we talked about the Hungarian Revolution, how he sent massive army against the Hungarian Revolutionary Army, put it down, and we talked about how so many Hungarian refugees escaped, and we talked about the impact of that on music because the Hungarian refugees brought with them their folkloric tunes and melodies, and this popularized their music. Well, back in Russia, one thing that he would do in order to terrorize people is this mock execution. And Dostoevsky was the subject of one, where you would be taken to court and you would be told condemned to death, and then you would be taken to be executed. And then just last minute, after they put up their guns and they're about to shoot at the person, then some messenger would appear theatrically and say all of a sudden, stop, stop. The wonderful, great Tsar, because of his mercy and his love and etc., etc., has pardoned this person. But remember, that person was standing in front of firing squad and is about to be killed, executed. Now, when I grew up in Syria, I told you now several times, Syria is such a fascist country, similar to Russia, if not worse. Russia at that time. I heard such stories in the early 80s when the Syrian regime was confronting very stiff opposition, and this would be just one way to terrorize the people. I heard from a friend of our family how during this critical time, they were just civilians returning home late at night, and they were stopped by a checkpoint. And I don't know what the exact details was, but he told me that the checkpoint asked them to step out of the car, asked them to stand against the wall, and then the army captain told his men, shoot them. And the men were about to shoot, and then no, let them go. And you can imagine that minute when somebody is about to shoot you, and then that changed a minute later. So again, whether that is related to Dostoevsky's experience and how that is represented in his literature, I don't know, but definitely if you read in world literature, excuse me, Dostoevsky's characters are among the most complex and profound that you can encounter in world literature. Tolstoy is equally important because remember what I said in earlier lectures when I talked about the figure of Goethe, and I said that we encounter during this history from the 18th century up to the 20th century, we encounter literary and cultural figures who live a long life. If you look at all these four people, all of them lived 82 to 84 years. Produced massive amount of literature, were immensely influential in their own cultures and beyond, and they come to dominate, become the culture of the time, and become kind of moral figures that people correspond with, people look up to. So in the Enlightenment, it was Voltaire, Goethe. I talked about him quite a lot. We talked about Hugo since when we addressed the theme of 1830, the revolution, and how he contributed to literature. You all probably know about his novel Les Miserables, which has been filmed so many times, put on theater plays, etc., done as you know Disney movies, etc. Tolstoy is probably the last such figure among them, and this man lived a profound moral crisis, and he later on in his life he became vegetarian. He influenced the movements against violence, and he's one of the first to start such nonviolent resistance movements. He had immense influence on Gandhi, and then he actually came. The Tolstoy family is an aristocratic family, so he was quite wealthy and became super famous with all the literature that he wrote. You probably have heard of his world famous novel War and Peace in Russian Vaina и Мир. So he had lots of peasants, and during his moral crisis and the evolution of his own character and psyche, he came to identify with the peasants. And you see here, he was dressed like a peasant, dressed very simply, avoided the ostentatious aristocratic life, actually worked on educating his peasants and played with their children, worked with them. So he had immense impact on Russian culture, like Dostoevsky, but he was really much more international. I remember years ago when I was undergrad and reading many of his works, um, I encountered letters that he received from people in the United States. This is late 19th century. Um, so, in addition to these two giants in world literature, we have here the figure of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, not Tchaikovsky, okay, Tchaikovsky. How do I know? I studied Russian for 2 years. Again, you all have heard some of his music, the Nutcracker. We talked about it earlier in the semester. Most of you, as school children here in the United States, you are probably bused to places where you heard it. That is not part of my cultural package. Um, I sent you links to certain works by Tchaikovsky that I want you to hear. What I want to point out here is one thing that relates to the two different links that I sent you. I sent you some works by Tchaikovsky, and then I sent you works by one symphony, um, Scheherazade by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. And if you uh, hear the music of Tchaikovsky and then Rimsky-Korsakov, you will see that there is very big difference between them, and that actually relates to philosophies and ideologies that became dominant in the second half of the 19th century. And the big question was, where should Russia head? Is Russia Should Russia follow the West? Is Russia part of the West, or should Russia go a different way? Is Russia, in that case, part of the East? You should understand that until the 19th century, people looked at Russia as some kind of an Asian power. So when Napoleon entered Moscow in 1812, he considered himself to be entering an Asian city, not what we understand today as European city. So the people who wanted to follow the West, they were called the Westernizers, and the people who wanted Russia to go its own way, they were called the Slavophiles. They wanted Russia to come with its own culture and not be just follower of the West. Now, this notion has actually immense importance for politics, so it can be used by Russian rulers and autocrats in order to say, well, we don't need democracy. Democracy is a Western thing. We Russians are going to go our own way. And Vladimir Putin, the current, excuse me, the current ruler of the president of Russia, uses such ideas and ideology in order to justify why he is not going the Western liberal way. That thinking had an impact on literature, had an impact on Russian philosophy, and even Russian music. So Tchaikovsky belongs to the group that went the Western way, and Rimsky-Korsakov is probably the most famous among the Slavophile Russians. If you look at this painting, a very famous painting done by the most distinguished Russian artist, portrait artist, and painter in the second half of the 19th century, his name is Ilya Ryepin. If you look at the furniture, you will see that this is so-called Oriental furniture. This is not the typical furniture that you would find in Western Europe. That actually goes hand in hand. Even the literature, the furniture in this painting goes hand in hand with this Slavophile philosophy. So Tchaikovsky, we can say, he was the person who brought Russian music to its highest point, and we can call him a kind of Russian Beethoven. One of the things that Tchaikovsky took to its highest point, to its zenith, it's program music. Remember, we encountered program music with Hector Berlioz, La Symphonie Fantastique. And in the links I sent you, I asked you to listen to Romeo and Juliet, which is a very famous piece of program music where um, Tchaikovsky puts the play into music. He really tries to tell you the story musically. Now, I sent you that piece not only because it's so famous, but also because it's much shorter than his biggest um, program music piece, which is called the Manfred Symphony. And Manfred is a play by the romantic British poet Lord Byron. And Tchaikovsky put it into a symphony which is massive, 1 hour long. We will listen to excerpt from it. But before I go there, just in case you are not familiar with one world famous piece of music by um, Tchaikovsky, I want you to listen to it. And that piece is um, The Swan Lake. Hopefully, you have heard it before. In case you have not, let's listen a little bit. Okay, and in addition to to this piece, the Swan Lake, the famous Swan Lake, as I was saying before, the Manfred Symphony is probably the biggest piece of program music composed by anybody. And there are people who dislike it, and there are people like Arturo Toscanini, the very famous Italian conductor who spent most of his life here in the United States, consider it to be one of the best and greatest pieces of music composed. So I didn't ask you to listen to it. Instead, I asked you for Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to have you here listen to an excerpt um, in order for you to have an idea. It's a gigantic symphony, as you see here. It's an hour long. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. So this gives you an idea about, in addition to the ones that I already sent you, this gives you an idea about Tchaikovsky, who is a very tragic figure. He was actually gay, and until now, it's not known whether his early death, he lived pretty short life, if his early death has to do with a disease that spread at that time, or whether he committed suicide because of um, some relationships and the fear that this might cause him a scandal. I don't know. And again, the question is debated. On the other figure who was probably not as great in terms of magnitude as the figure of Tchaikovsky, but nevertheless played an immense role in classic music. And actually, he is the one who is considered, as you see here in this poster of a conference, The Last of the Romantics. Mahler is really the last of the Romantic composers. After that, classic music is going to change, as we will see here today. So what I want to show you here is we want to hear an excerpt from his first symphony. Usually composers, as we have seen with Beethoven, they compose symphonies and then they find themselves later in their more in later symphonies, as in the case of Mozart, Beethoven, etc. We saw the exception with Hector Berlioz. His first symphony, La Symphonie Fantastique, was this immense success and immense influence. Mahler, like Beethoven, he composed 9 symphonies. His 10th was unfinished. Beethoven, by the way, has a 10th symphony, which is also unfinished. But opposite to and contrary to Beethoven, whose Ninth Symphony is the most famous, uh, Mahler, among his 9 symphonies, is actually the first that is composed. It's also very long. By that time, as we have seen with the Manfred Symphony, which is an hour long, Mahler's symphonies are very long. His third one is about an hour and 50 minutes long, huge. This one that we are going to see, listen to, is the first one, and it's one thing you can say about it: never in history has a symphony started so um, mildly and slowly and ended in such an apocalyptic way as we will see here today. So let's see how it begins. Its beginning, you can barely hear it. And what Mahler was trying to do here, he was trying to convey the nature, the idea of nature awakening. He thought that a symphony should include all aspects of life, and this is here one example. So this is the first movement. Can you hear anything? Finally, something. So that is for the first movement, and then he has a second movement which you can listen. I'm going to ask you to listen to the symphony, But to go back to the lecture, in the third movement, there's something very strange that he does. We will listen to it later, but that part of the symphony is actually based on this funny illustration from children's books. It's a print by a famous romantic painter from Austria called Moritz von Schwind, and the print is called The Hunter's Funeral. And you see here animals are actually parading in the funeral of a hunter. You see his gun, and it's a reversal of roles. And what the way this fits into Mahler's symphony. Remember, we said the first movement is about awakening of nature. So he probably looks at hunters as enemies of nature, and he wants animals to be happy and um, live their life without the threat of being hunted by this person. So roles are reversed, and the way Mahler expresses this is in a very funny way. Let's see how he does that. Okay, did anybody recognize the melody? Well, unfortunately, we are not in class in order to have a discussion about that. I don't know if you recognize the melody, but in case you didn't, here it is.
Frère Jacques, frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous, sonne les matines, sonne les matines, ding ding dong, ding ding dong. Frère Jacques, frère Jacques, dormez-vous.
Okay, everybody now is ready to sign up for French. This is a good exercise to teach you some French. Again, it's a world famous melody. We don't know who composed it. According to scholars, it's probably appeared in 18th century France, but again, we don't know who composed it. It's a world famous thing, and it's the most famous children's song in France and Francophone countries. So it's funny that Mahler took this um, melody and put it into his symphony. So let's go back to that symphony and see how what happens later on. And I'm gonna advance to minute 37. So this is the end of the the third movement, which is that movement about the funeral of the hunter, whose beginning we just listened to, and it is gonna end, and then we are gonna begin with the fourth movement, which is probably one of the most apocalyptic, if not the most apocalyptic piece of music ever composed. And one reason that makes this symphony so world famous. Okay, back to our slides. So Mahler, as you see, he also didn't live a long life. He actually died of a heart attack. He came to the United States and conducted a lot of classic music here. His last symphony actually includes something related to a heart attack, but I'm not going to go into that. And you see that from the date, this is really the date when um, modernism in music and in art was on the rise. So his death uh, and the music that he composed mark the conclusion of classic romantic music, and after that it's going to be modernist music, with an exception that I will show you next time. So before going on to the art and painting, I want to highlight an aspect of um, modernism that usually is not present in courses that have to do with the art and music, but actually is an internal aspect of modernism, and that is the rise of anarchism, and which coincided with the rise of what I called earlier modern um, terrorism. Anarchist, as you probably know the word, anarchist wanted to end government. This is really an interesting theme relating to the United States. Here, very far right groups, Republicans who believe that government should be an absolute minimum. They actually have something relating them to anarchism. Of course, the big difference is anarchists don't want any government at all, and they aimed at destroying it. And they carried out um, several assassinations that were very scary, big deal because, of course, of the development of the bomb. These terrorist attacks would not have had their impact if it's just about a gun shooting one person. But when it started to be bombs, and you all know now in our contemporary life how scary and how much upheaval they can cause. They One of the things that they did was the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, which is really a pity because this Tsar was not as bad as the one who came before him. Excuse me, and that was the ogre Nikolai II, that I have talked about him a couple of times now, and the one I mentioned him when I talked about the mock execution of Dostoevsky. I say that it's a pity because this Tsar was the one who abolished serfdom in Russia and was a reforming Tsar. And the assassination happened when somebody threw a bomb at his carriage that was passing in this area in St. Petersburg. And he stopped, and he heard that some people were wounded. He stopped, came out of his carriage in order to see what happened to the wounded people. And then another person threw another bomb, and that caused the amputation of the legs of the Tsar, and then he died shortly after. Um, the Tsar after him, Alexander III, built this huge cathedral that you see here on the right in St. Petersburg. Um, Many such attacks happened in the United States, including famous ones that happened in Chicago. And then, just as we saw with the assassination of the Tsar, an American president, William McKinley, was assassinated in 1901. This brought these series of assassinations brought the attention of important literary figures, and that's in this case, I think this is the first novel about terrorism, and that is The Secret Agent, which I think was written in 1907 by Joseph Conrad. That's the same Conrad that we were supposed to read and that I talked about him last time. Now, the amazing thing about this Conrad is that this man was not even British. When in history do you have somebody who is a foreigner coming from a different country who did not speak the language as a native language and then becomes one of the greatest writers of the language, the second language that he's learning of his adoptive country? So, as you see from his name, Joseph Theodor Konrad Korzeniewski is Polish, and his parents perished under the reign of that ogre, Nikolai II, and he left Poland and then became a seaman working on ships until he became a captain, and then wrote several novels. Many of them have to do with seafaring, but not this one. Again, you probably know, I don't know if you've read The Heart of Darkness in high school or you encountered his name somewhere else. This is one of the biggest, absolutely the biggest writers of the English language, and one of the greatest in world literature. I hope you did watch the excerpt that I asked you to watch. And again, I showed it to you last time in the lecture about the adaptation of his novel Heart of Darkness into the film Apocalypse Now. Now, we come to the theme of modernism, and we have here probably the most important symbol of modernism, which became the most important symbol of Paris itself. And this tells you something which was done, constructed in for the centennial of the French Revolution. Remember, the French Revolution happened in 1789. This was 1889. And it's completely something totally new. People were totally unaccustomed to it. A gigantic piece of metal. Of course, its construction reflects the development of the Industrial Revolution, metal working, and the ability to construct something on such massive scale that has never been seen before. And as always, or as sometimes happens, there are people who were horrified by it and couldn't believe that the profile of Paris was blemished in such a way. But again, frequently we have people who are denouncing the new, and then the new becomes a standard. And as you all know, the Tour Eiffel now is a symbol of Paris. Last time we looked at the painting Déjeuner sur l'herbe by Manet. We discussed several aspects of it. Last time I focused on the sexual revolution aspect of it, about the representation of the prostitute. How is that related to the economic and social political changes that were happening in France during the reign of Napoleon III, and how it was directed against middle class morality and norms. Okay, um, Manet never really identified, despite his connection with the Impressionist movement, he never really identified himself as an Impressionist. The man who really led that movement was a man whose name is very close to Manet, with the difference of the O. Okay, not Manet, this is Monet, Claude Monet. He's the one who submitted this painting, and it was among the paintings that were refused and not shown. And this painting, he simply called it Impression, impression, Soleil Levant, meaning sunrise, in 1872. And here we have an idea about the reception of the piece by an art critic called Louis Leroy. And here he says, quote, "Impression, I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship. A preliminary drawing for a wallpaper pattern is more finished than this seascape." End of quote. So you see, he's making fun, he's jeering at the painting, but actually, the word of the painting, the title of the painting that Monet used, and then his making fun of it actually stuck, and the whole movement came to be called the Impressionist movement. Now, I don't know about your generation. In my generation, and probably that's still true until today, Impressionism is one of the most welcomed, appreciated, and loved slash liked movements in art. It's probably the most popular. Again, I don't know about your generation. In my lifetime, you would see so many people, students, young people, and or even older, different ages, having posters and impressionist reproductions in their houses. Um, what impressionism does is really turn um, toward colors. Colors become the focus of the painting. It's no longer the subject. So Impressionism focused on the impact of light on the object that is being seen. And here you have two paintings. Actually, there are a series of paintings, but I have here one of each by Claude Monet. This is the Haystacks, and I remember, I think one contemporary um, Russian artist, we will talk about him later. His name is Vasily Kandinsky. He said the first time he looked at this painting, he didn't recognize that it is a haystack. Well, you might think, I don't know, it's some peasant house or something. Monet actually painted and repainted this so many times, because every time he was painting at a different time in the day, as the sun rose and moved towards sunset. He did the same thing with the cathedral in Rouen. Rouen is a city in northwest France, in the region called Normandy. And here, um, Monet rented an apartment in front of this cathedral, and again painted and repainted the facade of the cathedral so many times in order to convey how the impression is changing according to the change of the time of the day and the light that is being cast on the object being presented. So I'm gonna send you and ask you to watch some Khan Academy videos about Impressionism. I don't want to go further beyond that, and I want to move to music and to Claude Debussy, who's the person who started modernist music. Now, again, you might have encountered him, heard something of him that is world famous, and that is his Clair de Lune, which means moonlight. Let's listen a little bit. So I'll send you the link so you can listen to all 5 minutes of it. Again, you might have heard it, and I hope you have heard it before. If not, this is your chance to hear one of the most famous pieces of um, piano music. Um, Now, when you listen to it, you will see that in terms of structure, it follows the usual structure that we have been seeing in music. Now, I hope you have listened to this link I sent you about the Tristan chord, which I was related to last lecture. Hopefully, you have listened to it, but I want to pick here on um, just 1 minute in it and re-listen to it so we recover what this young musician was saying.
Where are we? Suddenly, we're in huge tonal ambiguity. It's not clear cut at all. Wagner is abandoning clear tonality in favor of constant ambiguity. And the implications of this are huge. Many argue that this is what leads ultimately to the atonality of the 20th century, this refusal to resolve into clear-cut tonality. But it's not just this chord or this moment. It's the whole opera. For about 3 hours straight, or maybe even more, Wagner keeps us in this plane of irresolution, always searching, yearning, reaching, but never fully settling.
Now, again, hopefully, if you have listened to the whole thing, he goes on and he actually talks about Claude Debussy. So let's reconnect here this lecture to what we encountered in the last lecture. Remember, in the last lecture, I talked about the year 1871. I actually stopped at that year and the immense events that happened. Remember, in 1870, there was the Franco-Prussian War. Prussia, which has been growing since the 18th century. Remember at the very beginning of our semester when I talked about the 7 Years' War and how it was the First World War. It was begun actually by Frederick II, so-called the Great of Prussia, as he was trying to expand his realm. Now that expansion continued. Despite being defeated by Napoleon, Prussia gained quite an amount of territory because of its contribution to the defeat of Napoleon, along with Britain and Russia. And then by that time, the only there were obstacles that standing in the face of Prussian unification, and these were first Denmark. So in 1846, Prussia defeated Denmark. And then the other obstacle was Austria. So in 1866, Russia defeated Austria. And then finally there was France. Now you have, if you study history or political science, this is an immensely important development in the history of Europe. Why? Because France was accustomed to having weak neighbors on its right side of its on the right sides of its borders. It was accustomed to seeing so many German states that were so small and divided, and it can use them against each other. Remember, we saw how Napoleon reduced the number of the German states from some 290 to about less than 50. Some people say 39. Again, I haven't counted them and I don't know what's the exact number. And I explained to you how that happened. Napoleon would, when during his conquest, he would give this German territory to another German prince and would tell him, okay, I'll give you the city, and in return you are going to give me 5,000, 10,000 soldiers, or give me this amount of money and contribute to my campaigns, etc. That's how Napoleon used it. But then as Prussia now grew, the last obstacle to its complete expansion over what became Germany was France. So Germany provoked a war with France and defeated it badly, as I explained in the last lecture. Now, the French were accustomed to having bad relations with the enemy on the western side of their borders, and that's Britain. And that animosity, that hatred, went back all the way to the Middle Ages. Now, with 1870, that's all going to change because now Germany becomes unified, and then France, being so badly defeated by Germany, and not only that, Germany took two regions in eastern France that are called Alsace and Lorraine. Why did they take them? Because long back in the Middle Ages, these states were actually were German-speaking regions. I actually know until now there are people in these French regions who still speak German as a first language or a dialect of German. So the Germans considered Alsace and Lorraine as part of Germany, and they took them away from France and then made France pay huge amount of indemnity. So that loss of these two regions was a bleeding wound for France and caused a change in attitudes in France toward their historic animosity. So now they started a rapprochement, they started making up with the British and would end up as allies in both World War I and II. Why? As a result of the creation of this German state, which took two regions away from France. So this change, what happened in this war, and again the taking away of land, caused massive. How should I say? I mean, French nationalism was already existent. We have talked about it and how it played a role in the French Revolution. But with this bad blow, nationalism became even stronger. And you had people who turned against everything that was German. And among these people is Claude Debussy. Now, again, if you heard the video I sent you, the link about the Tristan chord, we just watched another minute of it. He will explain to you or he explains in that video how Debussy was making fun at some points of Wagner, but again, nevertheless, he couldn't really like completely ignore him. But what we see with Debussy is, as we go from Clair de Lune that we just heard, if we go to another piece that he composed, and that piece is called Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune, which means the prelude of an afternoon of a faun. I don't know if you know what a faun is. That was a mythic half animal, half human being, the upper half being a human being, the lower half being a goat, And as you probably know, what is mentally associated with the goat is lasciviousness. Um, so this poem, which was written by Stéphane Mallarmé. Stéphane Mallarmé is one of the symbolist um, poets belonging to that movement that I talked about last time when I talked about Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud. These are the people who established symbolism in literature, and then it would be followed by other people. Actually, Clair de Lune itself was a poem composed by Paul Verlaine. You remember from last lecture how I told you Paul Verlaine had a relationship with Arthur Rimbaud, and they got so incredibly drunk that um, um, Verlaine shot at Rimbaud. Uh, so what Debussy was doing was putting so much French poetry into music. Um, and this one here would be actually a departure. This would be pushing Wagner's this ambiguity, this suspension, this refusal to resolve, um, would be pushing it further. So we have here that the usual tonal structure in the music, where you have, you know, um, rest, dominant, subdominant, and then again rest, would be abandoned. So I will send you the link to this piece, but let's listen to a little bit here. So when you listen to it, it's not very long. It's just about 11 minutes. You will see again this absence of resolution um, and moving away from tonality. That will be the first step that Debussy took, and then in the next lecture we will look at other composers who took it even further. When critics talk about the history of um, music, and specifically modernist music, they consider this uh, prelude to the Afternoon of Faun to be the marking point, 1894, the marking point of modernist music. In addition to this attitude toward the French and the desire to completely, I'm sorry, attitude toward the Germans and the desire to completely move away from German music and all that is associated with German music, what you might be call it its bombasticness, its um, its complexity. There is another factor that played into the development of Debussy's music, and that is the encounter with non-European traditions of music. Now, remember, if you are trying to get away from the German tradition and you are looking for something new, it would be understood as a matter of course. You are like trying to see what other people are doing. However, that discovery would have been impossible without colonialism. And that's why I have been saying that colonialism is an integral part of modernity and modernism. So here you have, for example, you might know that France, in addition to its expansion in Africa, remember most of Africa was occupied by Britain and France. Few colonies went to Italy, Germany had a couple, but then it lost them with its loss of World War One. So France was, in addition to Africa, France was expanding in Southeast Asia. You need to know, you probably know, hopefully from learning your American history about Vietnam. Vietnam was occupied by France before the United States got involved there. Okay, so um, we see here something that a tradition that started in 1851, and that is called Exposition Universelle. And today we call it World Expo. This tradition started in Britain in 1851. In my last lecture, which also started in 1851, I did not focus on this because I wanted to keep it for later, because it's a theme that has to do more with our current lecture. But there's actually, we were supposed to have an expo this year. It was supposed to happen in Dubai, and the United Arab Emirates was spending massive amount of money in order to make it the most impressive uh, um, World Expo, but then because of the coronavirus, it has been rescheduled for next year. So what happens at these expos? You can the World Expo was done in order to celebrate everything that was being produced, especially in terms of new machines, new products, but also artists were welcome to come and show their what they were making. Now, this poster for the expo, again in French, it's called l'Exposition Universelle, was the expo was in Paris in 1900. Usually, the expo happened every 3 years, usually, but then sometimes you had some years going by without it taking place. So when we look at this poster, look at this poster and see what is being represented here. Of course, in the background we see Paris, but the focus is on something else. Look, what do you see in the foreground? What do you see in the foreground? All these people are actually the colonized, occupied people. These are people from Southeast Asia, what we would call today, again, Vietnam, Laos, and that region. This man that you see here, this is not a woman, this is a man, that's actually traditional North African dress. Remember when we talked about the lecture in 1830, I said the beginning of modern colonialism began when France bombarded and then occupied the city of Algiers, and from there expanded to occupy Algeria first, and then it would occupy Tunisia, and then Morocco, and then Mauritania, and keep expanding. So this is a person from North Africa. When you look down here, the focus is not on the symbol of modernity, which is the Tour Eiffel that we see there. The focus is on something that really looks strange. When you look at this building, you don't know what to make out of it. Is this an Indonesian temple, or with the dome and these what looks like minarets? If this is a mosque, we don't know. But the main idea is what France is showing you here, sitting at the foot of statues of French women, are the occupied people. And that would play, again, an immense role in the arts and in music. So Debussy, when Asian groups, music groups, came and played in Europe, Debussy was one of these people who listened to them and tried to use their music in order to create something new, which is so different from the Germanic tradition. That impact of colonialism is not just on music, but also on the arts. Now, this is something for next time, Cubism, but it was this occupation of Africa, this digging deeper and deeper into Africa, brought the Europeans made them get in touch and see and acquire um, African art and all kind of things that they brought from Africa, including African masks. And these African masks, as you see, this is actually from Picasso's famous painting that we will talk about it next time, and you will watch the Cannes video about it. I'm just pointing out the relationship between colonialism and modernism. Another important concept for modernism is anxiety. Now, the question is, what are people anxious about? Again, it's unfortunate that we no longer have our lectures. We would have had a discussion. Okay, what makes you feel anxious? So what did people feel anxious about? There are two main things. And remember what I said at the beginning. We are always can look at phenomena from a leftist perspective and from right wing perspective. From leftist perspective, remember what I explained at the beginning. Leftists focus on what? They focus on the material conditions. They focus on the financial factors. Okay? Remember Marx's interpretation of history, as I explained last time, is that history is a struggle between classes. Okay? So a leftist interpretation would say people are anxious. Why? Because of the threat to their livelihood. And what was at that time the threat to people's livelihood was, of course, increased mechanization. Okay, as you had the Industrial Revolution was abolishing jobs, taking away jobs from people. Believe it or not, the Industrial Revolution, without this anxiety, worry about people's jobs, the Industrial Revolution would have happened earlier. Um, you know Elizabeth I, the famous Elizabeth, the British Queen, who lived in the time when Shakespeare was writing. Actually, one European inventor came to her with an engine, with a plan for an engine that resembles what later became the steam engine. And he said, he told the Queen, I can make this engine into, make it so in a way it would move your ship. And the Queen looked at him and said, why would you want to do that? What would all the people, all my subjects who are making their livelihood out of moving these ships, what would happen to them? So she chased them out, said, get away. We don't want that engine that threatens the income of my subjects. Okay, so this was when? Remember, this was about 1600, 200 years before. So this was, I'll give you another example. Do you know why the printing press didn't make it to the Muslim Arab world? For a similar reason. When the printing press was spreading in Europe, Muslims, of course, were in contact with the Europeans, and they could have adopted the printing press and started printing books in Arabic. It would have contributed to modernizing the Arab world instead of the Arab world going into its medieval period while Europe progressed further and further. Well, for the same factor, people there were worried, okay, if we print these books, what would happen to all these scribes, the people who write, who copy documents? They would lose their jobs. So there is an increasing anxiety, and now probably in your generation is not talked about it as much. When I came to the United States, remember I told you I came here in 1984, it was a major topic at that time, the danger of automation. It was at that time that factories, car makers, etc., were moving toward the computerization was beginning of machines, and it was a topic that was frequently discussed. Recently, I don't know if you follow the news. Last year, the topic of the danger of artificial intelligence, there are discussions, and you can Google it and read articles about it. How artificial intelligence is threatening human beings with the loss of their jobs. There were so many articles about which are the jobs that are going to be obsolete, that will be done by computers, and you no longer need human beings to do that. So this, and now we are going through it. We are going through this loss of income as a result of the coronavirus, which is making so many human beings panic and afraid. And if you watch the news, there's now for the past week now, there are people who are demonstrating. It started in the United States, but there are people in Germany and other parts of the world that are demonstrating and asking that they be allowed to work because um, how are they going to have an income if how are going to they feed themselves and their families if they don't work. So again, the idea about anxiety as a result of losing our jobs because of technical advance is something that started in the 19th century. And I pointed out before, and I repeat now, there were several instances of workers attacking factories, smashing machines, burning factories, and this continued throughout. Okay, so this is one source of anxiety, and that would be a leftist um, interpretation of anxiety, meaning the focus is on the material aspect of our life. Do we have an income? Do we have a livelihood? Do we have a secure job? Can we make it? The other one is the one that focus, remember, the right wing focus on ideas. To them, it's the idea that is important. So for example, the idea of a free market, the idea of democracy, these are the important ideas. So how did ideas contribute into anxiety? Well, there we go back to where we started, the Enlightenment. Remember, we said the Enlightenment criticized religion, um, went against so many ideas that were inherited from the past, put them into criticism and into question. People took these, and still until today, people take these very seriously. So I can give you an example. There's the German author, very great German writer called Heinrich von Kleist, who wrote, very talented man who wrote some of the best short stories and some famous plays in German literature. He wrote how, after reading the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, how he lost his faith and how painful that is for him. This crisis of faith, in addition to the crisis that Prussia, he came from Prussia, um, in addition to the crisis that Prussia went through as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, combined together to him committing suicide in 1811. So there's this factor about people um, losing their faith as a result of discoveries made by science, as a result of criticism of religion made by rationalist thinkers. Um, there's another type of anxiety here that was first discussed by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And he's the first one to make anxiety into a theme of a book. He has a book published in 1844, The Concept of Anxiety, which is, by the way, remember, this is the same year in which Turner made his painting about speed. And the concept of anxiety in Kierkegaard's philosophy is based on freedom. Kierkegaard says that the cause of anxiety in human beings is when they realize their freedom and then when they agonize on the choice they have to make. The masterpiece of Kierkegaard is a book called Either or. Okay, Either or. And either or is, again, as the title tells you, it's about the decision that we make. But that step toward taking that decision is can cause anxiety as human beings realize their freedom and then the implication of the choices they make. Now, Søren Kierkegaard was probably the last major philosopher who was Christian. Søren Kierkegaard was a very devout person, and Christianity is throughout his work um, is discussed, and he not only discussed it, he actually lived it. Um, he would become His philosophy would become extremely important in the 20th century, especially after World War II. And there is a movement that is called existentialism. The most famous philosopher of this movement is Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French philosopher. Um, if you ask your parents or your grandparents, they probably might tell you something about the importance of this movement between the 1950s, the 1960s, 70s, until the 80s. Existentialism was the thing to study, read. Even I, as an undergrad, I'm sorry, as a graduate student when I was at Stanford, most seminars were really small. You would have 6, 7 graduate students and not more. Well, I remember there was a big professor who announced a seminar on existentialism. There were like 25 people in that seminar room. That was not normal for a seminar about literature at Stanford, which is a small university. And again, most literature departments were very small and have had very few graduate students. So that tells you something about how popular it was. But so this is in the 1990s. But if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was enormously popular. And the central idea in existentialism and in the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre is the absolute freedom, that human beings need to be aware of that and need to take responsibility toward their actions. Any way of saying, well, I had to do this, I wasn't free to do it. Sartre would call it mauvaise foi, which means in English, bad faith. I'm not gonna dig much into further, into this because I want to move to um, the philosopher of modernity. But before we go that, we reached here the point from where we started. You remember the slide, hopefully. This was from the very first day of our semester when I told you that we are going to go from bravery to anxiety, from the famous painting of Jacques Louis David, to this painting by the um, Norwegian painter Edvard Munch. Okay, so remember at that time I told you that the Scream, which is all about anxiety, was, even though it didn't carry the title anxiety, the title anxiety was a year later. So let's look here, since I was talking about crisis in faith contributing to anxiety, let's look here at the philosopher who is most associated with this crisis. Again, I don't know what you know about Nietzsche. If we were in a class, we would have a discussion, but usually, probably from my own experience with students, as a student and as a professor here in the United States, usually when you ask students what do they know about Nietzsche, they either tell you they have heard about the idea of the Superman, or they tell you the idea that God is dead. Okay, so let's look at this second idea before I go to the idea of Superman. Let's look at this second one. Yes, it was Nietzsche who said, quote unquote, God is dead. And that quote happens in a book by him called The Gay Science, published in 1887. I have here a long excerpt, and I know this lecture is going longer, but I do need to do that. Consider it like more than a lecture about modernism. So let's look at this Quote, quote, have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours? An opposition here. Why would you need a lantern in the bright morning hours? Ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together, there he caused considerable laughter. Have you lost him then? Said one. Did you lose? Did he lose his way like a child? Said another. Or is he hiding? Is he scared of us? Did he emigrate? They shouted and laughed in this manner. The madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his look. Where has God gone? He cried. I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving now? Where are we moving now? Away from all suns? Aren't we perpetually falling backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Aren't we straying as through an infinite nothing? End of quote. Now, the quotation in the book goes on longer, but this is a famous passage which shows you the anxiety, the pain that is felt as a result of this idea of crisis of faith, the death of God, and as you see, um, Nietzsche is saying that we killed him. How did we kill him? With our science. Remember, again, I referred to um, the book on the origin of species by Darwin, all that criticism that religion was being subjected to in the 19th century, so that it became, for Nietzsche, a crisis that demanded a new beginning. And that's why Nietzsche called his most famous um, book, um, I don't have the title here, but I will let I'll let you know about it. It's called Also sprach Zarathustra, and in English it's called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Who is this Zarathustra? Um, Zarathustra is a Persian prophet, thinker, some people would call him a prophet, who lived about, historians don't know, probably they estimate he lived around 1000 BC. And what the importance of Zarathustra for world religion is immense. Actually, he had an impact on Christianity and Islam and Judaism. But the central idea, one of the central ideas, actually the main idea is that the world was dominated by two deities. One is beneficial deity, good one, and one is an evil one working around it. Why is that important? Well, from your encounter with the Greek mythology and what you need about what you know about the Greeks and the Romans, they had multiple gods. Okay, so what was happening here with Zarathustra is the reduction of the deities into two. And that was a major step toward monotheism, which would appear first in Egypt and then would be adopted by Jews, okay, and the Jewish religion, and then it would unfold with Judaism and then Christianity and Islam and come to dominate the biggest part of the world. So what Nietzsche thought was this, to him, this concept of good and evil is now an antiquated concept. This concept that dominated not just Zoroastrianism, meaning the religion that began with Zarathustra, but also all religions. All religions have notions of good and evil. And Nietzsche thought that it was time to move beyond that. So Nietzsche thought that we are going through major change. And with that major change, we have to reconsider the basis of our existence, how we organize our lives, meaning, he has a famous phrase, we have to revalue our values. And one of his books is called Beyond Good and Evil. And the reason why he chose Also sprach Zarathustra, thus spoke Zarathustra, is because Nietzsche wanted to undo what this man did 3,000 years before him. So Nietzsche wanted to criticize our values, subject them into a revaluation, and put our existence on a new base. Was he successful in that? Of course not. But one important idea for Nietzsche, one central idea that people, again, who speak about the Superman and the death of God, they are not aware of. But the central idea for Nietzsche was that the essence of our life is will to power. That might sound funny to some people, will to power, but actually, if you think about it, it is probably Nietzsche was right. That's the ultimate essence of that motivates our lives. Now, let's go back. You remember when we talked about Schopenhauer, we said Schopenhauer's major work was the world as will and representation. And I explained to you before that will represented the world of noumena for Kant. For Schopenhauer, it was the will to survive, to exist, and that will makes us go on living despite suffering. That will is indifferent. It's kind of a monstrous thing that makes us reproduce and continue our existence when in fact our existence is one of suffering, and it would be better to end it. The other realm is the realm of representation. Now, Nietzsche ignored completely this realm of representation and focused on the will. Now, Nietzsche, as a young man, he was an admirer of Schopenhauer and has an essay that I think he published in 1864 called Schopenhauer as Erzieher, Schopenhauer as an educator. But then Nietzsche rebelled against this teacher of his. He wasn't really his teacher. It's not like he studied with him, but he was following him through reading his philosophy. He rebelled against its pessimism. He wanted values that reaffirmed life, not values that looked negatively on life. So Nietzsche turned against Schopenhauer. And to him, his consideration is that, again, this will is not a will to just reproduce and continue, not a will to survive. No, it was actually a will to power, meaning that human beings are always pushed by their desire to acquire more power. Well, think about it. You might find it funny, strange, or not, but think about it. Why do you study? Why do you go to college? In order to have a better career, in order to have better income. What does that bring? That brings you power. That brings you the ability not just survive. The more income you have, the better your life, the more powerful you are. And look at who are the most powerful in our society, despite it being a democratic society. The most powerful are the rich. So you work, You acquire education, money, and then with money comes what? Comes power. Look at how politicians vociferously attack each other. Why? Well, becoming a senator is you become powerful. You start participating in the decision making. Becoming a congressman, you become powerful, and becoming president is even more. Look at what's happening in Syria. The Syrian regime, headed by this man called Assad, has been slaughtering people since 2011. Why? He simply wants to stay in power. So even though the idea might seem funny to people, um, Nietzsche was probably right. And I'm not saying this because I like Nietzsche. I actually find his philosophy totally unpleasant. But after living and reading and contemplating for decades, um, I've come to realization that yeah, he is right. Nevertheless, I disagree with Nietzsche on something very important, and that is the importance of representation. So I still ascribe to Schopenhauer's philosophy with the Nietzschean uh, amendment, so to speak, that the will is not just a will to survive and to continue, it's a will to power that rules us. But the realm of representation is enormously important because we are always told that the motivation of other human beings in their quest to power is always covered by something. I'll give you an example. One of the things that I find really offensive to me personally is when I hear about these candidates when you say, "Oh, so why are you candidate? Why are you becoming candidate for the United States?" They tell you, "Oh, because I want to serve." I personally consider that an insult. Really, you want to serve? There are so many other ways you can serve people. You are becoming a candidate because you want to be the most powerful person in the United States, and the same thing applies to any congressman, to any senator. Okay, all these politicians who go, so they tell you what is the representation. The representation is, well, I want to serve, I want to have, you know the same thing you hear from doctors. So why are you studying medicine? Oh, because I want to help human beings. No, the fact most people are studying medicine because they want to be rich. That's it. So um, back to Nietzsche and his idea about power. Unfortunately, there are so many negative associations. Why? Because Nazism, like with so many things, misused so many things in German culture, misused Nietzsche. Nietzsche was not an anti Semite, absolutely not. If anybody tells you Nietzsche was anti Semite like the Nazis, he wasn't, and he actually explicitly wrote against anti Semitism. But this idea about will to power and his idea about going beyond good and evil, and I don't want to go further into his philosophy about who adopts what values um, were used by the Nazis, and especially people talk about this idea of the Superman. As I told you, most young people, when you ask them if they have ever heard of Nietzsche, they tell you, "Oh, yeah, I heard about the idea of the Superman." What does that mean? Simply, Nietzsche was saying that human beings have in their attempt to go beyond good and evil, they have to overcome themselves, meaning they overcome their what keeps them limited as human beings and move beyond their condition, and so they move into what is called in English Superman. In German it's called Übermensch. Mensch in German means human being. Über means above. So what Nietzsche was talking about is not Superman, this funny idea and funny translation. He's talking about the man who, or the human being who, um, goes beyond his limitations and the world into he was born and the values in which he was raised. Okay, Enough about that. I want to highlight here that Nietzsche was also a poet, and not just, silly poet. He wrote some really interesting poetry. I have here an example for you that you can read. This poem was put into the fourth movement of Mahler's Third Symphony, which is the longest symphony ever composed by any composer. I think it's an hour and 14 minutes. As one one thing that shows you the impact of Nietzsche on the art movement of his time, actually a little bit after that, Nietzsche, you probably know, became mad. He collapsed probably because of syphilis. He collapsed in 1890 while in Italy. It's a very famous episode and scene. He was walking near his house when he saw a man dragging a horse and beating the horse so savagely that the horse collapsed on its knees. And it was interesting. This man, Nietzsche, wrote so much against pity. He considered it a negative thing. This man who wrote so much against pity ran and hugged the horse that had collapsed on its knees. And from there, he completely lost his awareness and his existence, but continued living for 10 more years before he died in 1900. During his lifetime, he did cause some stir, but there was not massive interest in him. But that did happen, as frequently happens, did happen after his death. His philosophy became popular and unfortunately was, as I said earlier, was misused by the Nazis. But among the people who were inspired by it, in ways you wonder like why. This group in Germany called Die Brücke. Die Brücke in German means a bridge, and actually they decided to use this title for their movement, which is an expressionist movement, not impressionist, expressionist. I will talk a little bit more about the difference in the next lecture. So they decided to adopt this bridge as a title for their movement from a quote from Nietzsche, in which Nietzsche says, quote, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss." And remember, again, I told you what Nietzsche meant by Superman, Übermensch. So remember, this is the idea about how man has to, human beings have to overcome their animal limits and move beyond in order to become Übermenschen. Here again, the expression is Superman. And you see this, this painting would cause actually the creation of a movement. This painting was done by a Russian painter called Vasily Kandinsky, who moved from Russia and settled in Germany, in Berlin. And this painting, Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, would lead to the creation of a movement, art movement, expressionist art movement in Germany. Now, at the end, actually, before I go over these manifestations of modernism, I want to show you this book by Nietzsche that you see here, Also sprach Zarathustra, was put into music, and that music was adopted to a very famous film, one of the leading films about science fiction. The film, you probably heard of it, was produced in 1968, and it's called 2001: A Space Odyssey. So let's listen to that music that Richard Strauss composed for that book, that famous book that I discussed by Nietzsche. Okay, so in addition to the use of this famous piece of classic music by Richard Strauss, the makers of the film use another very famous piece of classic music, and that is Johann Strauss. We did not talk about him, the Blue Danube. So when I send you the link, do listen to it. It's a very famous, probably the most famous waltz ever. Okay, let's go back and conclude our lecture with talking about causes and manifestation of modernism. So some of these we have already talked about it. Remember what I told you about how Marx questioned liberal thought, which had been shaping Western cultures for so many years, whether be it France, England, Britain, etc. Okay, so now you have a new system of thinking, and that new system was put into, became the doctrine of a superpower after the Russian Revolution. Of course, it's ultimately failed, but take a look around. There are still many people who believe in, maybe not as much in the United States, but around the world, but even among the United States, and especially among university intellectuals, you will find people who use Marxist thinking in order to question um, the injustices that are found in capitalist countries. Last time we also talked about Charles Darwin, and I mentioned today how um, his theory contributed to this crisis of faith and still continues until today. Okay, at the beginning of the semester, we talked about the Enlightenment, and I told you how important it was, um, the thinking of Isaac Newton, how important and central it was to Enlightenment thinking. So the world in the Enlightenment, as a result of Newtonian thinking, was conceived as a watch made by a benevolent watchmaker who oversees that order. However, um, as you know, with Einstein's discovery, that Newtonian order would come to an end. In art, we talked about Impressionism and how I told you Impressionism moved away from the subject and started focusing on color, on light and color. They became the primary thing, not the subject, as has been in the history of painting. Painting was always trying to tell you a story. Um, Whether it is a religious story, history painting, and then we saw, landscape painting. Now it is not, the story is not the subject. The subject is the color and the impression that human beings get from that. Today, I also talked about in architecture how the Tour Eiffel was something not seen before and marked starting point for new architecture. In previous lectures, we talked about the appearance of the concept of speed. In Turner's painting, we talked about the train and then the telegram. Well, that is going to even become more important with the invention of the car. So the carriages would disappear, and then a total new way of transportation, not just the train, the car. And then soon after that, the airplane would appear. And then the airplane is going to play a role not just in commuting and in traveling and in shrinking the world, but also in warfare. It would come to be incredibly destructive. And that we will see next time when we talk about World War One. Okay, I've already told you about Einstein's, you all, or as you say in English, Einstein, and how his uh, physics replaced the Newtonian physics. In the year 1900, Sigmund Freud published his very important work, Interpretation of Dreams, and developed the theory of the subconscious and started digging deeper into studying human motivation and human behavior. Finally, just like with the Impressionist, light and color became the subject of painting in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who's the most important philosopher of the 20th century. It was language that became the central concern of philosophy. It was Heidegger wanted people to be aware that the language that they use is in order to describe any phenomena, is as important as the phenomena itself, or even actually more important. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said as important, more important. Heidegger has an important sentence in which he says that language is the house of being, meaning the house that contains existence. So I know this has been a long lecture, but that's okay because I haven't been doing 2 lectures a week, and some other lectures hopefully were a little bit shorter. So I hope you will put up with it despite its length, because it covers some important ground about the rise of modernism. Take care.